Does he want me like to talk to you, to refer to you as John, or just act like I'm in?
No, don't talk to me.
Okay.
I'm talking to the congregation.
Okay.
Turn off your machine up there. I'm getting a lot of static. Your headset. I don't know what. You have to change something on it. I'm getting a lot of static. Okay, when did you first come to Newport Mesa Christian Center? Just elaborate any way that you want to on that.
Okay. I first came to Newport Mesa Christian Center, then Glad Tidings Assembly of God, in the winter. Actually, it was Christmas time of 1970. The church had wanted us to come as pastoral candidates, and I was at a position of campus pastor at Evangel College at that time and did not feel that I could jeopardize that position by letting it be known I was going to candidate at a church. So I indicated I would be glad to come as a pulpit guest for a couple of weeks at the Christmas season, and then we could decide where to go after that. And so I came those 2 Sundays during the Christmas break of 1970 and preached, and then went back, and the church let me know that they would like to vote on me as a possible pastor for the church, and we concurred that that could happen. I still didn't know what I was going to do in terms of a response, but in a Wednesday night business meeting or a Sunday business meeting, I'm not sure what, it was a Sunday business meeting now that I think of it, they voted to extend an invitation for me to become pastor, and it took us a period of a number of days to really thresh out God's will, but in late January of 1971, we accepted on the provision that I couldn't come full-time until June of that year. I needed to finish my contract at Evangel College. So for a period of 5 months, every other weekend, I flew out to the church and ministered on Sunday, and then caught the red-eye special back to Kansas City to Springfield, Missouri, and was in class at 7:30 or 8 o'clock on Monday morning. And then we came full-time in June of 1971.
How big was the church at the time you come? What was the status?
The size of the church at the time we arrived is a matter of varying interpretation, and I myself probably have used different numbers over the years, and Jewel has used different numbers. I've heard her describe it as 60. I've described it as up to 120. I've described it at 80. I guess I honestly don't recollect. I do recollect looking out in the sanctuary and there being enough empty seats you could have shot a cannon off in the platform and not hit anybody. But the church building itself sat 160, and I believe that the 2 Sundays I candidated, there were no more than 60 to 70 present. The membership roster, that was the effective active membership roster at the election where I was balloted upon as pastor, there were 73 names on the list at that time. However, when we revised the list in June, 6 months down the road, there were 49 people left. So somewhere along the line, either in my first few months or before I even came, a third of the church had dropped off. So I know that there were 49 active members as of June of 1971, and how many were in attendance in those days? Probably it did range on a real low Sunday all the way down to 60, which would have been maybe a Christmas Sunday, and on a real good day, maybe it got up to 120. So somewhere in that range, I think, is what the size of the church was.
What attracted you most to the church?
I think the thing that attracted me to the church was a sovereign call from God, first of all. I had said when I was just a young person, and a very, very young person, that I felt God calling me into pastoral ministry. When I did my doctoral work at Fuller Seminary, I chose as my thesis a topic entitled The Role of the Campus Pastor at the Evangelical College. I anticipated I would be a campus pastor for the rest of my life, and that would fulfill the pastoral call. However, in my first full-time year of campus pastoring, I had been a part-time campus pastor prior to that, but in the first full-time year after I did my doctoral work at Fuller Seminary, I remember that there was a great revival at Evangel College in October of 1970. It was the last week, in fact, of October of 1970, And in one of the evening services, I felt a distinct impression inwardly that said to me, look around here, because this isn't going to be your place of ministry much any longer. I looked across the sea of student faces in that chapel. At that time we had about 1,000 students, and I felt so fulfilled doing what I was doing that it was like some stray thought from out of nowhere that you want to brush aside, and yet it was such a distinct, if you will, visionary experience that I couldn't brush it aside even though I didn't tell anybody about it. Months later, after I had accepted the call to Glad Tidings Assembly of God, I realized that the Lord had put some things together on the other end, that the church, which was then, as you know, named Glad Tidings rather than Newport Mesa, the church had set aside the last week of October of 1970 as a week of prayer and fasting as they initiated their search for a new pastor. So the Lord was working on both ends, and when the invitation came from the pulpit committee to us to consider coming out to the church and preaching as a potential candidate, the thing that made me open to act positively upon that was this clear sense of, look around here, this isn't going to be your place of ministry. And I felt that I needed to allow myself room to test out God's will in that area. Of course, then when we came and met some of the wonderful people, and especially the sense of vision that was present in the people that were in the church, and the sense of wanting to reach the community, that was enormously attractive. And so that's sort of what put things into the ballpark originally. And I saw an area that offered a great challenge to a young minister just starting out, a challenge to reach a community for Christ, and that was very attractive to me as well.
What kind of involvement in missions did the church have at that time?
I don't know of what precise involvement the church had had in missions prior to my coming, except I do know that on one occasion a group of people from the church had all gotten together and gone to somewhere in the Caribbean for a wonderful evangelistic crusade. The church did support missionaries, and when I came, the missionary support level was at the rate of $257 a month, with missionaries receiving between $5 and $10 a month commitments. So the church supported a number of missionaries, but they were in small amounts. The reason I remember the specific amount, $257, is that during my first year of pastoral ministry, we did not increase that number. In fact, there were months on end when we didn't even keep up with the commitments we had because the bills were so pressing at the church. We simply ignored the missionary commitments that had been made. And that was the first major spiritual test or lesson that I had in pastorate, was centered around those missionary obligations. You see, early on when we came, I thought, well, here I am, I'm 29 years of age and fresh with a graduate degree and all these kinds of things and filled with zeal and enthusiasm, and we're going to see this church grow dynamically and reach this area. And the exact reverse had happened. By the time midsummer of 1971 came along, the church was in a wonderful state of decline. And the finances were horrendous. We needed somewhere around $400 to $500 a week to meet just our general operating budget. And I think we were taking in between $250 to $300 a week. And a preschool that was supposed to be producing at least a balanced budget, and if not a profit, was instead producing a deficit that in those summer months was running close to $1,000 a month, and that was eating up our general fund revenue. I can remember going down to Southern Cal Edison and Southern Cal Gas Company and paying electric bills or gas bills on the day that the church electricity or the church gas was going to be turned off. Things were so bad. And finally, along in mid-July or late July, I began to have board meetings on Saturday morning, weekly, to eat breakfast, to pray, and to decide which bills were going to be paid that week. And that went on for a number of weeks. Nothing initially changed. And on the fourth such prayer meeting, it was the third Saturday morning of August 1971, after we had had breakfast and prayer, began to decide which bills to pay, we were just in an awful mess. And I recall that Harold Hunt, who was the old man on the Board of Deacons at that time, he was in his mid-30s then, I believe Harold was. At least he was older than I was. And Harold suggested that we should take whatever offering came in on the next day, on Sunday, and catch up, if possible, 2 weeks of missions, and that we should pay those missions commitments prior to any bill, including the pastor's salary. And he admonished us that the missionaries were every much in need of financial support as Southern California Edison was, and that we had simply neglected what God regarded as very important. And we had neglected our missionary commitment because it was not painful to us. It would be painful to us if the electricity was cut off, but it wouldn't pain us any if the missionaries were cut off. And so the board heard that, and they all felt that was a good idea, voted to do so, had prayer. And after prayer, I was asked as pastor, was that acceptable with you? You did understand that that motion included foregoing your salary if the money comes in. I honestly did not hear that in the original motion. But I readily agreed to that, and that next day, without any announcement to the congregation that we had a financial need, I'd never announced that because I was too embarrassed to announce it. And we simply asked the ushers to come forward, receive the offering. When the offering was counted at the end of the day, it amounted to $1,330. That was great on the third Sunday of August. In fact, that up to that time was the second highest offering that the church had ever received. The only time it had gone higher is when it had sent a group to the Caribbean that I had mentioned some time ago. And so there we were, able to pay 2 months missionary commitments. And then within a year after that, the Lord dealt with me from the book of Leviticus about sins of omission, and that although we had gotten caught up with our missions, we had not increased, and that was an omission, and we were capable of increasing. So I scheduled a missionary conference, invited 6 missionary couples for a weekend and a keynote speaker, flew them out from Springfield, Missouri. We announced our public goal as $12,000 a year, which, given the fact that our pledges were $257 a month, times 12, that would be what, about $3,000 a year or something like that. 12,000 was quite a leap, but privately, Wayne Tesh and I agreed that we would ask the Lord for 30,000 and have faith for that. And when I scheduled a Friday and a Saturday and a Sunday service with the missionaries, Friday we had an international dinner, and about 100 out of the 300 people then in the congregation turned out. And Saturday night came, just a regular service, and all 12 missionaries, 6 couples, and the guest speaker were there. When I began the service, there were only 12 people from the congregation there. And I had broken the news to the missionaries earlier that Saturday that we were really going to see $30,000 come in. And I was horribly mortified and embarrassed that that night only 12 people from the congregation were there. I never in 17 years after that ever had a Saturday night service again. But it was while leading the song service that night that the Lord reminded me of the incident from the Gospels where he had told the disciples to go across to the other side, and then a sea storm had emerged, and in the middle of that storm they became very panicky. And when the Lord later quieted the waters, he rebuked them that they had no faith. And the reason why they didn't have faith is that they had forgotten he had said, "Let us go across to the other side." And I felt the Lord reminding me during the singing of that song as I was embarrassed and hiding my face in the hymnal, not even looking at the congregation because of the small crowd. I felt the Lord saying to me, "This is your storm, and are you going to have faith in me that I gave you that word of $30,000 or not? If you have faith in me, you will stop this song service at this point and publicly declare it to the congregation, something you've been afraid to do until now, that tomorrow we're going to receive $30,000 in faith promises." So I fought and fought with that, and finally, before we sang the last verse, I stopped the song and announced that I was in my own particular storm, but that I wanted to declare as a faith in the Lord that the Lord had given me a word that tomorrow we'd receive $30,000 in faith promises from the congregation. I could feel all the missionaries feeling sorry for me already and wondering about all the good churches they could have been in that weekend that they'd missed because they were stupid enough to come here with this rookie pastor who didn't know what he was doing. And now the guy has slipped off into some psychotic world and is announcing this incredibly impossible goal, and what have we got ourselves into? But anyway, we went ahead, finished the service, and the next morning rolled around. Those days we had 100 in the first service and about 200 in the second service. When the faith promises at the end of the first service were tabulated, they came to a total of $18,000. I was ecstatic, and all of a sudden I said within myself, well, not only are we going to hit $30,000, we're going to hit $56,000, because the 11 o'clock service has twice as many people, and if 100 people gave $18,000, 200 people will give $36,000, and we'll have $54,000. But it doesn't work that way. In fact, an interesting thing I learned pastoring this church over the years, that the larger the crowd, the smaller the offering. And I still am not sure of why it works that way. But I think it's because everybody looks around, sees the crowd, and assumes that somebody else is doing the giving. But when you're part of a smaller group, you realize if you don't, it isn't going to be It isn't going to be done. So the 200 people made their faith promises, and then they were brought up to the front. They were tabulated, and we did no hysterical thing like we're now at so-and-so and we got so-and-so to go. We just add them all at once and quietly announced the total. And the total from the 11 o'clock service came to just barely over $12,000. The two together were less than $100 over the $30,000 mark. And it was a monumental leap for that church to go from $257 a month, which was about $3,000 a year, to $30,000 in one jump. And from that time on, we tried to remain true to increasing our commitment to missions. And I'm deeply committed to the principle that a missionary giving person as well as a missionary church will be a growing church spiritually, numerically, and in every other way. And I find in my present work as a district official that so often churches make the mistake of looking first at their own needs rather than at kingdom needs. And the Scripture says, the liberal soul will be made fat. And given it shall be given unto you. I don't give to get. But on the other hand, I do know there's a principle of liberality in the Scripture. And we need as a church to corporately demonstrate that liberality by giving first to the kingdom. And several times in succeeding years when we would have financial crunches in the church, we realized that we were under attack, I believed, from the evil one in our finances. And we would meet as a board and we would deliberately take what little we had left in the treasury and give it to some missions agency and basically use that giving as an act of defiance to say to the devil, every time you hit us, we're going to hit back harder. If you attacked us, we're going to attack you. And it really grew to be a tremendous challenge and a delight to see what we could do for the cause of missions. I don't believe we can ever give too much to missions.
What's your favorite memory of Newport Mesa Christian Center?
It would be very difficult for me to define my favorite memory of Newport Mesa Christian Center. In fact, as I have pondered that question, I realize I do not have a favorite memory. What I have is a tremendous sense of warmth about all 17 years of pastoring this church. Whether the warmth is associated with the worship services, or whether it's associated with board meetings or staff meetings, or meetings and small groups and prayer and Bible studies, even times when we had disagreements and concerns of various kinds, I remember with warmth the wonderful way in which people received me into their lives and their homes, the warmth of baptisms, of weddings, the warmth of being present to families in emergencies, in hospitals, in times of bereavement, times of funerals, the warmth that came in watching people respond to the Lord, giving their life to Him, of dedicating themselves to Him. The warmth and the nature of this caring and loving people is an enduring memory. I think of the warmth of that we experienced as a family here, and the fact that our children grew up to love the Lord here, and that came because people cared for them. In fact, now that I'm on the road every Sunday, and of course always going somewhere to preach on Sunday, but our kids remain here, and George Paul is away in Illinois now in college, but we've asked our children at various times, well, do you want to go with us today? And their instinctive response is, no, we don't want to go with you. We want to go to Newport Mesa. That's our home church. That's our church. And you hear so many horror stories about preachers' kids. I believe that the success of our kids and their love for this church stems directly out of the warmth of the people of this congregation who extended to us as a family the most gracious consideration at all times. And I literally, therefore, have no favorite memory, but I have a flood of individual memories which are all warm and good.
How large was the church when you left?
I'm not sure how large the church was when we left. I hope it was large-hearted. I don't know about the numbers. Preachers do this funny game. When they go to conventions or whatever, they talk about numbers and dollars. Well, how many are you running, and what's your budget, or what's your missions budget? And we always use the number that makes us look the best. And so if I wanted to impress someone, I would say, well, Newport Mesa has over 2,000 people. And then I would say under my breath, hopefully to be honest, but maybe so that to catch them if they couldn't quite hear it, Newport Mesa has 2,000 people if they all showed up at one time. Which I'm sure we did, if everyone would show up at once. I think we know from our count that we averaged around 11 to 1,200 scattered over the 3 morning worship services, which brings up an interesting point. So, we should have never been in a situation where we had to go to 3 morning services, because the sanctuary was supposed to have accommodated 800 people. And we did not realize that it did not seat 800 people until the day the pews went in, and I began looking around saying to myself, the place looks big, but I don't think the seats will seat 800. And so I got out a tape measure and measured my own girth and what I guessed to be the average girth, and sure enough discovered that we had room to jam-pack to seat about 650, and that's just every seat crammed in. And when I went to the architect about it, he explained that he had used the ratio which is standard for churches, 18 inches to a person. Well, evidently, Newport Mesa does not have too many 18-inch wide people. And so we wound up with a slightly smaller seating. Well, what began to happen as we were at a period of time when we were filling the 8:30 service, or full from church growth statistics is 85%. When you're 85% full, you're full. And both 8:30 service and 11 o'clock service are running full. And we thought, well, what we will do is start a 3rd service, and we'll get that one up to 85%. That, at least during my tenure, did not happen, but it was theoretically designed to allow us room for growth. Really believe the congregation would have grown more rapidly had more people been able to fit into time zones that they were comfortable with. And let's face it, a great many people in this congregation do not want to get up at 6:30 on Sunday morning in order to get here by 8 o'clock. They're more comfortable with a later hour, and therefore the later services tend to fill up well. And I hope the day will come when down the road NMCC will be able to go into a building program that will accommodate all the people that want to come at a more ready hour.
What memory comes back to your mind while sitting here in the congregation?
When I sit here, what memory comes to my mind as I ponder the question? I think of one thing immediately, that my father's casket was right here at the front, and that 4 years ago he passed away, and I gave a message at his funeral entitled "Worker for the Lord," and that experience has a lot of memory for me when I think of my relationship with my dad and how in his later years of life he was able to be in this congregation. And I recall how Dad would go out after Sunday school. You could always see him slip into the sanctuary about 10 minutes into the service. And the reason why he slipped in is he was going all over this church plant, turning off lights. There was something in his soul that couldn't stand to see the church picking up the electric bill for an unused light. And then he would always tell me after the service, he would beat it to me and he would say, "I found X number of lights on today, and you really need to get on top of that." And I have memories like that. But and again, I could probably, sitting here, think of 1,000 different kind of memories. I recall when this building was just a shell, and in fact, the sides weren't even up, and some of us came in here that were in leadership and put Bibles in the 4 corners of the church, sort of being mystical to indicate that this church is symbolically constructed on the foundation of God's Word. And I recall the wonderful opening Christmas Eve service when this place was jammed to the rafters. And what a wonderful time it was to realize that we had come through a marvelous time of transition in this congregation, and through a time fraught with peril. When we left the 22nd Street facility, we really didn't have the financing ready. We didn't even have the plans ready yet for this facility. And neither did we know really what the price tag was going to be. We had a general idea, but in terms of experiential reality, we didn't know what it was like to step from making payments of $1,200 a month to $33,000 a month. And that opening evening was a wonderful time. And of course, all the services thereafter, just I could probably go on endlessly with memories. The final Sunday night service where our family was here, and all of our tapes for the last umpteen years were on the platform as a gift to us, and a bouquet of stale chocolate donuts. I still remember that green sport coat being given to me, and then I was given in bouquet form some of my favorite edibles, which is waxy covered chocolate donuts. and they were given to me sort of to hold as flowers, and it was a joke, but since I'm partly ham anyway, I immediately bit into one of them, and I realized the minute I sunk my teeth into that thing that it did not taste right, and it was extremely stale. I managed somehow to get the thing down without gagging it, and down on the front row, Diane Tesh and Lenora Weaver were just choking in hysterics because they had prepared this bouquet of chocolate flowers, I think about a week earlier, and had sprayed it with wax to keep the chocolate from melting. And here I've eaten this horribly stale stuff. You know, I look back upon that with fondness and memory, and just a lot of other things too. People who, to be on a more serious side, persons who came forward at the close of the services to indicate needs for prayer, personal commitment to Jesus Christ, a prayer for healing, a prayer for God to be with them in dangerous passages in their own life. All those bring back a wealth of meaning to me too.
What comes to mind when I mention the merge with First Assembly?
When you mentioned the word merge with First Assembly, the thing that strikes me in reflecting upon it is the first service we had on September the 15th, 1973. The backdrop of that was that in the Newport Beach location, our church, which was Glad Tidings Assembly, had become Newport Christian Center and had had a spurt of growth to about 300 people. And we had begun to cast around looking for a place where we could have additional growth because we were boxed in with growth. I have what I call the Arkansas chicken coop theory of church growth, which is that chickens die down to the size of the coop. And our coop was too small at 15th and Monrovia. So we looked around for places. Wayne Tesh and I, in fact, had gone all over this area, and I think we have personally claimed more land for the Church of Jesus Christ than any two people living in this area. And none of it materialized. And I became aware that First Assembly in Costa Mesa was having some financial difficulties, and so based upon the information that I had privately received from several people, I went to talk with the leadership of the church and suggest that since the 22nd Street Church had twice as much facilities and maybe 60 people, and we had half the facilities with 300, that we might better use our resources to combine. And so we talked it out, adopted principles of merger, which were overwhelmingly approved by secret ballot vote both in the Costa Mesa Church, which was First Assembly of God, and in the Newport Church, Newport Christian Center. Our first service was September 15, 1973. It turned out that most of the people, the greater majority of the people at the Costa Mesa Church were elderly people. And we in the Newport Beach Church had almost no elderly people. And that first Sunday, the place was just jammed. And afterwards, I remember some of the people like Bill and Martina Matthias and others from First Assembly who came up to me, some of them with tears in their eyes, and said, "Oh, Pastor, we have prayed to see this church one day filled with young people, and we have lived to see God answer our prayers." And the significant thing about that is that many of these people on fixed income had given extremely sacrificially to keep meeting the indebtedness of that church and to keep its doors open. And they had prayed and stuck with the church when it would have been easier to hike out somewhere else. We do have this phenomenon in Southern California that we are not as much into responsibility as we are into fulfillment. And so it is a wonderful thing to witness a church body where there is a core of people who will hang with you when the times are tough and will remain committed to Christ and committed to seeing something through. That's a marvelous spiritual trait to inculcate. It's always easier to run and go find some place that is more scintillating, but it is another thing to stay by something and see it through. And these friends had stayed and sacrificed, and they were overjoyed. It was like some of the biblical people who say, with my own eyes I have seen, and I've lived to see what was promised me. And I have a warm glow of feeling about that day of merger.
What do you suppose was the cause of the growth of Newport Mesa while you were here?
I am not the best person to ask what the cause of the growth of Newport Mesa was. I believe that there are divine factors and human factors. I'm very aware of the divine factor where the Lord says, unless the Lord builds the house, they who labor, labor in vain. And from the human side of things, my only regret is that we did not grow more. There were various times we hit barriers. I think we hit a 300 barrier early on in the church, and it took us getting into larger facilities to break the 300 barrier. And then in the 22nd Street, we hit a 600 barrier. We got to 600 people, and again, we were short on facilities, and we could not grow past that 600 barrier. And then for the last several years of my pastoring here, we were at a 1,200 barrier. And I think that, again, was a matter related to facilities, that every single classroom on this campus, not just the church, but the school campus, was in use, and that we had in effect outgrown our ability to accommodate people in smaller groups and Bible cell functions, Sunday school functions, and the like. That's just a private opinion. I'm not sure. I don't know if that's scientifically accurate or not, but I know that we hit a 1,200 threshold that we didn't get beyond. Some of the human factors I look at are that, and I tried to tell this to pastors in doing what I'm doing now, but so often churches wait to add staff until they've reached a certain level of growth. And I recall from the Bible that Paul went into the city of Philippi with 4 full-time people, including himself. There was Paul and Timothy and Silas and Luke, and there wasn't a single convert in the place, but they already had 4 pastors. And I would hear periodically at the church, well, maybe NMCC is overstaffed. And my feeling is that if you add staff carefully and wisely and prayerfully, staff will lead you to growth because they will develop ministries and involve more lay people and volunteer ministries in the congregation. And we tested this out a number of times. We didn't have really a viable singles ministry. And our singles that met on Sunday morning were a handful, less than a dozen. We asked Jason Garcia to come in and be singles pastor, and all of a sudden, poof, the singles ministry took off and involved scores and now hundreds of young single people and older single people. We were in the same shape with our junior high program. We had less than 20 kids coming out for junior high meeting during the weeknight. Alan Battenfield, we added full-time on staff, basically like you'd send a missionary. You send a missionary full-time, whether he has any converts or not, and say, go make a church. And Alan was added, and in comes a tremendous number of junior high kids. And the same way we developed the audio-visual ministry of the church when John Huntley came on. We didn't have the funds to do it at the time, but we sensed God leading him and God leading us, both in audio-visual and in missionary outreach. And we said, let's go do it. And I know that there were people over the years who said that Newport Mesa Christian Center was built around expositional preaching, and to some extent the growth of the church could be traced to that. But I think that the hidden factor that was really more dynamic, or at least as dynamic, and I think maybe more dynamic than a regular ongoing exposition, was the fact that very carefully there was a team of ministry built up both on the staff and in the lay leadership of the church that became a powerful force for the Lord. And no one person, including me, could have ever built this church to the degree that it was built. It was a sense of everyone coming together, finding their role of ministry, being comfortable with it, and settling down and being the people of God in that ministry. And that's a particular treasure about this church, that happened here. And I pray that it will always characterize the church.
300, 600, and 1,200 plateau, and next one's 24.
I don't know. 3,000 is the next one.
The last one. From your vantage point now, what would you like to leave with?
I am the former pastor of the church, and when I installed Pastor Jim Bradford, whom I believe God really, genuinely, supernaturally sent to this church, just like I believe God sent me here for my 17 years, I believe God sent Pastor Jim Bradford here for whatever years God will give him. But in my closing message, when I installed him, I read from Joshua chapter 1, and the lead in to that chapter says, Moses, my servant, is dead. And I analogized that to myself and said that the past leader, God wants everybody to know the past leader is dead. So I I don't go around pontificating on advice for the future of Newport Mesa. God will lead the present pastor. The only thing I'm left to rely upon is that there are certain scriptural things that can be said by way of scriptural admonition, and that I'm comfortable with. But in terms of specific direction, I would never offer that either privately or publicly, because when God released me from the responsibility of pastoring this church, He also released me from the responsibility for direction. That's not my responsibility now. But in terms of biblical concern, I think that one of the dangers the church always faces is the danger of comfortability, that we all settle into comfort zones. And it is exceedingly uncomfortable to stretch oneself to accommodate new people coming in. But I think the success of the church is never measured by how many people are inside of it. The success of the church is measured by how many people are yet to be reached from the outside. And the job of this church and this community will not be done until every last man, woman, boy, and girl has heard the gospel and been incorporated into the body of Jesus Christ, the church. I recall when, a number of years ago, when I was in Springfield, Missouri, I stopped by with Jewel to see E.S. Williams, who for 20 years was the General Superintendent of the Assemblies of God from 1929 to 1949. E.S. Williams was a very quiet-spoken person, a very godly man, a very humble man. In fact, the day we visited him, he was in his 90s. His wife was in her 90s. Both now have gone home to be with the Lord. And Brother Williams sort of apologized for not being as presentable as he would have liked to have been when we visited him in his little home in a retirement, in the Assemblies of God Retirement Center in Springfield. He had explained to us that the vacuum cleaner several weeks ago had gone on the blink, and that he hadn't wanted to cost the general counsel any money by getting it fixed. So we asked him what he was doing to vacuum, and he said, well, he had just been going around picking things up out of the shag carpet. And that's the way he was. He didn't want to cost the general counsel any money, and he was general superintendent that way. And he was a wonderful model of Christianity. And I sort of went to him like a young man seeking a patriarch's blessing. But in the course of that conversation, I asked him, I said, Brother Williams, as you look at the Assemblies of God today, do you have any concerns that you would like to express to me as a younger person coming along now, and things that I should be aware of? And he said that essentially his time of leadership was over, and he would not try to proffer advice to the incumbent leadership and the like. But he said, I only have this concern. He said that as we continue to develop as a church, the pressures for socialization will grow more and more, because by habit, as human beings, we are social creatures. And that pressure towards socialization may eat into our desire for spiritualization, that we will become so comfortable with one another, we will lose track of the vertical relationship with God and God's call upon us to reach our world. And I think his advice for the whole Assemblies of God movement is valid for us as a local church as well. In the midst of enjoying this wonderful thing called koinonia that we have at Newport Mesa, and there was a time when we didn't have such good koinonia, and God helped us to work hard to see that developed over the years. But there are words in the Bible that describe the church other than the word koinonia. True, we are to be a koinonia body where we have a great emphasis upon fellowship, but evangelization or evangelism is also a word that is integral to our being. And from a sociological point of view, evangelism works against koinonia from this sense that evangelism disturbs our comfortability. Suddenly we've got to turn around and explain things to people, and we can't use our cozy words that we're all comfortable with and our church language, and we have to start over again, and we have to take people and their problems and make adjustments and need to love them and reach out in special ways and not hang around in small cliques. But you know, when it comes right down to it, the more we will undertake the work of evangelism, actually, incredible wonder of wonders, it will enhance koinonia, because when we gather together to talk, it will not simply be about well, what happened to you this last week, or what happened with the Dodgers or the Angels. We'll be God talking. We'll be talking about what the Lord did. And the more evangelism-centered we become, I believe the more Christ-centered we become as a church. And therefore, I think in looking at things, just from a biblical perspective, we have to realize that those pressures are operating in any church, and they operated here when I was pastor. They'll continue to operate. The pressure towards socialization works against the call to evangelization, and we need to keep those in balance. And if we get too comfortable, we are outside of a biblical reason for being, and we need to be uncomfortable enough to depend upon the grace of God. I trust that always in this church, it will be seeking to have the kind of thing happen in it and among it that could be explained only by the fact that God was at work. Good grief.
Had to go.
In August of 1972, we came to visit in April and met with a number of young married couples that weekend, and took us a few months through the summer
Her
to...
sound disappeared? Okay. Well, she's pointing, she's leaning my direction, and the microphone's the other way. The microphone on your collar, on your green ears.
Hey, babe.
Okay, one more time. When did you first come to the church?
Wayne and I came with our daughter Renee in August of 1972. She was 16 months old at the time.
And what brought you to the church?
It was an invitation from the pastor, George Wood, at the time. We had made a previous acquaintance with him at Evangel College while Wayne and I were both going to school. I had worked for George as his personal secretary in the campus student life office for 2 years, and our friendship and acquaintance continued on even after he had left and come to California. And it was probably that relationship that brought us to mind when he began looking for a CE director and an assistant pastor.
One of the things that I remember is that I spent 2 years with George with a group of other individuals in a Bible study that met once a week while I was a junior and senior in college. And we would study the book of John, and all during the summer we would be writing letters to one another and just keeping a study going. So George and I knew one another from Bible study, work employment, just as a friend before we ever became involved as a worker with him in the church. We were just good buddies, that's all.
How big was the church when you come?
I know one thing. See, church attendance never really was that high of a priority on my list, because Sunday school was the high priority on my list at that time. And I remember we broke the record of 55 in Sunday school. After we ran a Sunday school campaign, we finally broke that big record of 55. And I just felt so good about that. And I said to George, I'll never forget it. I said, well, George, we're on our way. We broke one record. Let's keep going. I'll never forget that.
What was the biggest attraction to you to this church?
I think one thing that really impressed us was that in the year that we came, prior to that, the church invited us to come out in April. And on that weekend, we met probably 20 to 30 young marrieds, all in George and Julie's living room one evening. And I looked at that group of people, and I think Wayne and I talked about this after we left and returned to New York, that a church that was that young and had that much potential, and just sharp couples who were really eager to get on and do things in the church for the Lord, that was really impressive to us. And we just had a real positive experience that weekend, and it looked like a real challenge, something where we could really be involved in, and it would be fun doing it. They were wonderful people.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I more or less answered the phone one night when George called and said, "Wayne, would you like to come work with me at a small church in California?" I had no idea what California was about. I had no idea what church ministry was about. I just showed up and said, "Well, George, looks good." And I remember going into the back bedroom for the final negotiations. And I said, "George, if you expect me to come and move my family all the way from New York out to California for 2 years, forget it. I want to know what your commitment to the church is, because I'm willing to spend a lifetime if need be." And he said, "Well, as long as God's working in my life in that, I plan to stay here for a long time." And I said, "Well, on that basis, then, I'll come on out and we'll see what God will do through us." Little did I realize how that all came about and how the Spirit of God ministered. But it was a commitment for the long term, not something short term. It was, and we came, and there were about 150 people in attendance at the time, and about 50, as I mentioned before, 55 people in Sunday school. So it was just loaded with potential. But then again, I was 24 at the time, and I didn't know what potential was. It was just whatever God had in store, we were going to do it.
What kind of involvement did the church have in missions at that time?
Oh, I remember the first missions convention. We came in August, and in October was our missions emphasis. It was the first missionary emphasis that George had for foreign missionaries. I remember calling up all the consulates up in L.A. to have them send the flags of the various nations, and we thought that was a nice way to get the flags, and I went up to the consulates and picked up all these flags from all over the world, and we strung them through the sanctuary and had them outdoors, and we had a time in which they met with the missionaries, the congregations did, because after the Sunday service we all went over to people's homes to just have a time of an encounter with the missionary one-on-one. But I remember one thing, financially especially, is that I made a bet with the board member. You see, you've got to understand, I wasn't aware that ministers weren't supposed to bet. But I made a bet with this one board member when I said, "Dave, if you believe that the Spirit of the Lord is on this, I'm sure that we'll be able to raise over $30,000 for missions." You have to understand, at that time, the missionary offering was $5,000, so going from $5,000 to $30,000, he said, "No way." I said, "Well, I'll bet you a steak on that, a steak dinner, that we'll get more than $30,000. And when we counted it up, we had something like $36,000. I was happy because not only did I get a steak dinner out of it, but I was happy to sense that God was doing something great. And it was just the beginning. To realize in 17 years that you go from 5,000 to 500,000. Not that money is the measuring stick, but it's just awesome to be able to participate in something like that.
What was your main job, and what did you do when you first come?
I think you need to rephrase that. It's what I didn't do. I did everything. I remember planting grass, watering grass. I mean, we we didn't even have enough money to buy a sprinkler head, so I would go out there and use my thumb on the end of a hose and water the grass.
Changing light bulbs.
Changing light bulbs. I remember visitation, Sunday school, painting, hauling tables, all the things that I do today. But there's one story about the grass, is because we planted grass, we received a deduction from the city on our tax rolls, because now it was under control. Instead of one ugly lot, at least now we had grass where we could mow it. And as we started putting grass, a man drove by and he gave to us 12 eucalyptus trees so we could plant on the perimeter of our property. And it was just those little things that you knew that God was directing every step. If the Lord was that concerned about planting grass and providing eucalyptus trees, he must really be concerned about this church as a whole. And I have used that analogy in my life many times. If he's prepared and could take care of the trees, I'm sure he could take care of the people in the church. One little side comment on that is the grass, we had gophers in the grass. And I once went out on Saturday because I had to get rid of these little ground gophers. And I took my golf club. I'll never forget that. It was my 9-iron. And I put the hose down the hole, and as the gopher would come up, I just tee off on it. And here I am, I already killed 2, and I'm after the 3rd one. And across the street in Bond Publishing House, all of a sudden I heard a bang on windows, and I look up and I see 15 people standing on the 2nd floor looking at me with a golf club with the water hose down in the ground, and trying to get this gopher. And I looked up and I saw these people with a huge sign that said, "Thou shalt not kill." And I'll always remember that. Thou shalt not kill a gopher. So when I saw Bill Murray's Caddyshack, I couldn't help but realize I can identify with that, yeah.
John's going to edit that out.
Yeah, I'm sure it will.
Were there any special thrusts in the early church that you can remember, especially evangelism thrusts?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
It seemed like in those days there was nothing you couldn't do. It was, if someone came up with an idea, George was willing to try it, and the basic, I think, unwritten philosophy was, if the Lord is in it, it'll succeed. And if he's not, it'll fall flat on its face, and we'll go another direction. And I think one of those attempts was when we did a basic evangelistic outreach in the community and used the Mesa Theater as our facility for it, and offered to show the movie The Crossing the Switchblade. And I remember publishing information in the church newspaper about it, where we were going to publicize it, and something happened in the print.
No, I remember this. George was supposed to get Pat Boone to come.
That's how it was.
So if George said he was going to get Pat Boone, I was young and naive. I figured he could get Pat Boone to come, so I printed up a newspaper that had Pat Boone in it. And when George told me that Pat Boone wasn't coming, I said, well, what are we going to do? So we had to cross off the line that Pat Boone would personally be present, because he was the star of The Crossing the Switchblade. I also remember we showed the film The Late Liz, which is a story of an alcoholic lady, a recovered alcoholic, Gert Behenna. And what happened is that we did a survey and found out that more alcohol was being sold out of Lido Isle and Newport Beach than any other place in the United States at that particular time. Because of the yachting capital, people would buy a lot of alcoholic beverages and go out to sea for a week or so. Well, we figured there were a lot of alcoholics down at that area, and they needed to be set free with the gospel. So we had The Late Liz come on Monday and Tuesday to show the film at the Mesa Theater. And on Monday and Tuesday in the theater business is known as dog nights. And we packed out the Mesa Theater twice on Monday and Tuesday, and it was just an overwhelming sense of God doing something great as we reached out to take care of the people that God has called us to. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that I went up to rent the movie, and I didn't realize it, but it was an X-rated place, and they had this film in an X-rated office, and we were making approximately, I think it was about $500 a week is what the offerings were. And at that time, I had spent over $5,000 or $6,000 to get everything all set up back in those days. George didn't have board approval, but I didn't know what board approval was because I've always basically thought that if God was in it, he would take care of it, so you just step out on faith and everything would be fine. And I'll never forget having the guy at the X-rated movie place where we got the late Liz from. He made the statement that he said, you know, I would like to just give this film to you so you don't have to worry about and pay anything for it. So that saved us a couple of $100s, and I thought it was a great way of just advancing the kingdom, you know. But how we got the film, and I mean, it was just one of those real weird, different situations that we did. I also remember one of the things that we used to do. We used to have puppet shows at Westminster Mall during the Christmas holidays. And I remember talking to the lady who was in charge of the mall, the manager of the mall, who would give us permission to come in and hold 15-minute a puppet story around Christmas time. And we were on 15 minutes and off 15 minutes, and we did that for 4 hours a night during the Christmas season. And really had a lot of shoppers. At that time, Westminster Mall was the place to be, and had a lot of shoppers fill out cards and get acquainted with our children's ministry that we had. So I remember that. Anything else you can think of? And Praise 74 over at the fairgrounds. How we set up this great big booth that we had going, and we had shows going on for all these Christian people in 74. I mean, those were the good old days. Praise God they're not here now. But I remember those, yeah. Anything else you can think of?
Mm-mm.
How did the merge come about between First Assembly and Newport Mesa, Newport Christian Center?
You want, from your perspective?
I think we had reached a point at Newport Christian Center at that time where we needed a facility. We were packed to the walls, and we were already having 2 services, and it became apparent that First Assembly of God across town in Costa Mesa had a large facility. Their congregation had dwindled, and they were looking for bodies to fill up a building. And it just seemed a good use of kingdom dollars to bring the 2 congregations together. At that time, I don't know how much precedent there was for doing that in the assemblies, but we said again, if the Lord is in it, it'll work. And it became a marriage which to this day I think has had nothing but good results.
You know, I remember starting the second service over at 15th Monrovia Street, and we counted 14 people at that first service, and from that service we grew to approximately 150, and we had about 350 people in 2 services. And we then moved to 22nd Street where we could expand as a church, and that was probably the reason why we merged, is that First Assembly, it just seemed a natural thing to do, is to merge and get on with making a name within the community.
Do you have any favorite memories of that time?
I recall prior to our merger, when Wayne and I first came to the church, there was a preschool located in the church which operated during the week. And Renee, being preschool age, it was a natural. Our family needed some income, and I taught pre-kindergarten for the first 2 years that we were here in the church. When we merged, that was something that we did away with, and have not, since that time, have not had a preschool involved as an outreach of the church. But those were happy memories for us, because while she was little, I had an opportunity to not only be teaching in the preschool, but able to spend time with her.
Memories. I just have so many memories. can you put into words a feeling of relationship that you have for men and women that have deeply impacted your life? One of the memories that I remember is the missions, the miracle of missions that Sunday. Being able to see Dan and Jeannie Anglin, they were first-time missionaries at that time, going out. How we put them in the middle of the sanctuary, all their missionaries that were at the missions conference. Then that little congregation just gathered around, laid hands on them, and prayed that the Spirit of God would be with them. That, I think, was a very thrilling memory. I think the memory of moving from 22nd Street over to the chapel at Southern California College, and that last service that we had, realizing that when you put the church up for sale on an open market, you have to take whatever buyer comes. And realizing that there was a cult that purchased the facility that we set apart and prayed that God would use that property for His kingdom. And we didn't know how to go about it, basically, but I can still recall, as the whole congregation that were there for that last evening, we held hands and we circled the sanctuary, and we prayed that the Spirit of God would have His way in a very special way. And within 2 years, that cult left the church, and now there's a Pentecostal work that is on 22nd Street. I think that one of the highlights, and I feel this so many times, is being able to walk on a dream, to be able to be in a facility that's halfway completed, but to realize that it was a dream that you walked, that I have the privilege of walking on. Sometimes I just walk through this facility and I just feel so honored to realize that very few men and women have the opportunity to walk on a dream, and this was a dream that I'm able to see into fulfillment. And all the people that have made this possible, I think those are some of the greatest memories that I have had.
What do you remember about the college chapel in the trails?
I think one of the fond memories I have, and it has carried from 22nd Street to the college chapel to this sanctuary. I remember one Sunday during a service when, after I had attended here, I had gone to a special service on Memorial Day weekend at the Crystal Cathedral. And I realized what an impact decorations and some of the beauty that can be added to a service, how much that means in terms of ushering people into an attitude on holiday emphasis. And one of the things I have always enjoyed is making sure there's a special touch in the sanctuary as people enter on a special season or an occasion. And one of my favorite memories of the college chapel, I'll never forget stringing garlands at Christmas time from pillar to pillar. And even though we did a lot of things when we first began worshiping there to beautify it and spent several $1,000s to bring it up to a standard that we felt would be pleasing to people as they entered, that's one of the favorite memories I have of that building, was because it was laid out just right for the size of decorations that I could handle, and things were spaced just the right amount of space apart, and that became a very practical thing. I think Wayne could probably reflect more on the trailers.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was a day-to-day
Oh, yeah.
place of work.
I remember what we had to do. I did a survey to find out that it rains between November and February. It will rain 1 out of every 4 Sundays. So it meant that we had to do something about taking the people from the trailers to the chapel, where they could be out of the rain, in a sense, or out of the mud. So we built some walkways, wooden walkways, some of the slipperiest wood around, and especially when you get on that adobe mud. I fell many times. Just walking around, I would fall. But I can remember women in high heels getting their heels caught in the wood, and they would just walk out of their shoes trying to go to church and look nice, and it was so muddy, and I remember that. I also remember the trailers that whenever anybody walked in, it felt like an earthquake. But we knew, because we could look out the window, we knew it was going to get better. We knew that the light at the end of the tunnel was really going to be something more important than the oncoming of a train or New Jersey, as they say in New York, you know. But it's just the idea of the mud, the earthquake feeling all the time, and knowing that things would be better. And they were. Much better.
The building of this building?
The building of this building. Any memories?
Storage space.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to say anything on that?
You need to tell about digging out the basement
Yeah.
for the ground floor level, or for the basement level.
Just the storage behind your area. I remember seeing on the plans that we had a 10 by 90 foot span that they were going to build. And
You're losing your energy.
oh, thanks. Thanks. It's just, I don't read the building itself. The only thing that I remember, and I still can't understand, that on dedication week, we did something that I thought would at least get some TV coverage. I still thought that whatever you do things well enough, or something that where men and women would be able to see it. And we looked at this community, this church within the community. We looked at the church as being a gift to the community on Christmas. So what we did, we took red ribbon. It was red polyethylene.
4 feet wide.
4 feet wide, and we made the office building with Early Childhood Center, that the building next to where our present sanctuary is. We made that, and we made it as a great big bow so that it looked like a box for Christmas. And I thought for sure somebody would say something about it, and I couldn't believe that TV cameras didn't think that was something to bring about some good news or something. It was just beyond me at that point. But that's what I remember about the new facility.
If you could say something to the congregation for the future, what would you say?
I would hope that the same spirit would pervade this congregation in the next 50 years, should the Lord tarry, that we have sensed over the past 17 years that we've been involved. I think we could honestly say there has been so little internal strife, and we've even commented among other staff members in the past couple of months as we were preparing for this 50th anniversary, that so many times when you see other churches struggle and split, and a few years later split again, so many times those things are caused by internal strife and jealousy and the kinds of things that tear down the work of the Lord rather than build it up. We've had so little of that, and I really think that the Lord has blessed this congregation as a result of that, and we have let things that were of a minor importance remain minor, and the things that were important in the Lord's sight to be emphasized.
That's good, babe. I think that it's a spirit of dependency upon the Lord. I recall in 1972 walking into George's office as we sat down and we said, from 1972 to the year 2000, what would we like to see within a church? We said we would like to project a 10% growth rate and increase offerings proportionately. With that in mind, what would we like to see happen? Little did I realize that focusing on that would make such a big difference in my life and within this church's life. To be able to sit down and say, we still have the potential, because the Spirit of God is here, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set those who are bound and who are captives and enslaved to a lifestyle that is not Christian. Jesus Christ can make a difference. And this church can continue to have an impact in people's lives with proper priorities and being able to say, wherever you lead, God, we're willing to risk and try. And if we fail, we fail. But if we succeed, we boast not in what we have done. We boast in what God has accomplished through us. Because I really believe that this church has been blessed to be a blessing within this community and around the world. And the fulfillment of that is just a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat, a lot of tears, financial sacrifice, but it will make a difference. I believe that.
What do you think caused Newport Mesa to grow like it did?
I don't know. I just don't know, John. I'd like to say the ministry of George Wood, but I know George wouldn't appreciate that much, because the bottom line is that the Spirit made this church grow. Men and women who were bound together in kindred spirit, who believed that God could do something great. That's what made this church grow. And it's the Spirit of God. I used to be able to rattle off what I thought made this church grow. And the bottom line is the Spirit of God has blessed this church. And it's obvious as to what's taken place. We've got a long ways to go. But we have to look back at how far we've come and realize that the Spirit of God is still leading and guiding and directing us, and that He'll never leave us nor forsake us, for He's right there. He's our closest friend. He is the Lord, and He will bring forth what He wants within this church. I sometimes have this dream of seeing God looking over the balcony of heaven and saying, where are the people that are willing to carry my heart to this world? And He says, oh, there's a group in Costa Mesa, Newport Mesa Christian Center. Let me bless them. Let me help them. They would like to accomplish, according to my word, the principles that are right, to reach a generation for me. I want to help them. And I could just see God looking over the balcony of heaven and say, oh, those people, I just want to bless them more. And that's how I feel. That's how I feel. So when you say, how has this church grown? The Spirit of God.
What's the funniest thing that happened?
Have you asked this to
Funniest
everybody?
things?
Have you asked this to everybody, the funniest thing? No?
Not everybody.
Oh, okay. I remember
think-
one time.
It was after the fire in the office.
Oh, yeah, after the fire in the office at 22nd Street, George came up on the second floor, and he was really dejected. And just at that time, a newspaper reporter came by and saw what was taking place and pulled in because the fire trucks were there and that. And I'll never forget this picture of George holding up an adding machine in his Hawaiian print shirt. And the caption was, "Church burned. This is what's left," basically. And I always thought that was kind of humorous. And I told George, I said, "George, what an opportunity for us." And I was very positive, turning the negative into the positive, and, God's for us, and everything's going to be okay. Somehow this is going to work out for his good. And I was just telling him that. He said, "Yeah, right." I'll never forget that, "Yeah, right." But one story that I like to tell on George is, maybe you can tell the story about skiing with Roger and Marlene.
No, that's quite all right. Don't tell.
Oh, I think that's a funny one.
No. No, because
The fire, that burned for a long time, didn't it?
actually their plan was foiled if it was in fact set by an arsonist, because they didn't realize when they set the fire on the desk in the secretarial work area that on the exact opposite side of the wall out in the hall was the fire hose connection. And when the fire burned the longest and hottest at that point on that desk, it burned right through the wall, melted the connection on the hose, and caused a natural geyser all night. So most of the damage from that fire was caused actually by smoke.
And water.
Smoke and water rather than actually burning
It shrunk
property.
the drapes a good 18 inches because the smoke, and it was just an unbelievable sight. I remember I was the first one there that Saturday. I drove down 22nd Street and I saw all this water just running down the gutter, and I saw that it was coming from our church
It was a
parking lot.
nursery.
And I looked and I saw it coming over on the second floor, coming down, coming out of the nursery. And I said, "What has taken place?" And then to see the smoke, it was incredible, just an incredible experience. My library was totally smoke damaged, and I still have books that I use that have gone through the fire, literally. And I remember that experience. I remember once crossing in 22nd Street, there was a baptismal tank in the back of the pulpit area that was pulpit, choir loft, baptismal tank, and we would always keep that closed. And one Sunday morning, I had to get from one side to the other side, and I couldn't go around because of classes that were there, so I thought I'd just go through the baptismal tank like I have many other times. This time it was filled with water, and I went in both feet before I realized there was water because I was in a hurry. And I had to come home, change clothes, that was rather one of those side things that happened.
And the Sunday morning, the tank flooded here
Oh, I'll never forget when the baptismal tank flooded
in this
in
facility.
this facility. We come in the morning at about 7 o'clock, and we saw the hymnal just floating in the organ well that we had at that time. And water was all down the aisles. We had to call the fire department. They had to come in with their specialized vacuum cleaners, and we had to pump out the water. And we didn't have an organ that Sunday, and it was just one of those unique little things that took place. But that happened constantly at 22nd Street. We were all the time calling the fire department over to mop up the sanctuary from the leakage of the women's restroom. You can take that any way you want to, but it would just overflow, and it would just run right down to the altar down front, and we'd have to vacuum all that water up. Oh, those were some of the interesting days. I remember knocking out walls. I had one office over on 22nd Street that had 3 doors to it. And back in the 50s, everything was cubicle, small cubicle Sunday school rooms. Well, we knocked out 2 walls, so I was the only guy that had 3 doors and an office that was about 9 by 18, at 9 by 20. It was just a long, narrow room with 3 doors, 3 entrances and exits. And we never had the money to fix it up. And I remember one lady came for counseling, and I had a desk and 2 folding chairs in this long hall, echoey chamber. She came in and she was depressed to begin with. And she opens up the door and she goes, "Damn, this is depressing." And she walked out, and I never saw her again. And I used to put up poster board because we couldn't afford shade. I used to put up poster boards over the window, and I think I was the only guy that used to work with sunglasses because the sun was just so bright
Glare.
and the glare. So I put up poster board and maps, and then I'd take them down and put them back up again. And I remember working like that for about 2.5 years.
We've come a long
We've
way,
come a long
needless
ways.
to
We've
say.
come a long ways.
What do you remember about the remodeling of 22nd Street when we first moved in?
Oh, I remember the parking lot sale. Coming in, cleaning out some of the cupboards and the cabinets, and having a grand parking lot sale with a lot of the items that were in excess. Sometimes that didn't make a lot of good relationships early on in the marriage with 2 congregations, but it seems like no matter where we went, George had a reputation for cleanliness is next to godliness. And if we clean up the inside and create an atmosphere where there's a standard of excellence, people respond to that. And it was just a good way to show a new change and a new start. And I think that had some good effects in the long run.
What do I remember? I remember working hard. I remember carrying stuff, just boxes of stuff, taking out couches, putting them out in the parking lot for sale. Yeah, don't be too dry. I remember how, I also remember, you talk about funny things. I was in charge of fireworks stands one year. And I remember George said, "Oh yeah, we need a fireworks stand." So I got him a fireworks stand, and I told the company to have it come in late Sunday night after 9 o'clock. Well, somehow they didn't understand, and they came in at something like 4:30. So right on our parking lot, we were selling Red Devil fireworks, and people came out and said, "What's going on here?" It was just one of those humorous things at the time. It wasn't humorous at the time. No, it wasn't. Oh, some of the things, yeah.
Anything else you want to say?
I'd like to say how fortunate Diane and myself have been to be able to have a daughter who could attend school in one place and be supported by aunts and uncles and close friends. Because when we came out here, we didn't have any family. The church was our family. And the church has modeled that throughout the years that we have been present, that it is a caring, loving church. And I appreciate their prayers, their support, and their willingness to do the things that only God has called them, us, to be a part of. I really I don't want to use that quote from E.T. Quantabush, but it's so important. Hats off to the future. Hats off to the past. Coats off to the future. We've got work to do, and we're not through yet.
These lights
Thanks,
are getting
Dan.
hot. Oh,
Good. That's a wrap.
you got a lot to edit out of that. Oof.
In 1940, June 1940.
Okay, when did you first come to First Assembly of God in Costa Mesa, California?
In June 1940.
And how big was the church when you came?
There was about 6 grown-ups and 15 children.
Can you answer more in complete sentences?
Oh, well,
That would be, you know, like, when we first came to the First Assembly of God Church in 19 whatever,
mhm,
and when we came, there was so many people,
mhm.
so on and so forth.
You want to just kind of make a story for him, huh? Like, or,
Huh? Yeah, like you're just talking, you know, like you were doing in the other room.
oh, I
When we
see.
started to ask you
Oh,
questions,
oh, I
you
see.
started
You didn't want me
elaborating.
just to answer, just,
Yeah, just
Oh.
started elaborating a little bit on it,
oh,
okay? Okay, and now let's start over.
you're not recording it now.
No, we just.
Well, I was wondering, we were living in Anaheim at the time, and we just had a feeling to come to Costa Mesa one Sunday, and, you know, just came. And this little pastor was just discouraged, and he just turned it over to us.
You were not voted in or anything?
Oh, I guess we was later on, maybe. I can't remember about that voting business, but I guess we was, I'm sure.
So, when you came, how big was the church when you first come?
It was, they only had just about 6 grown-ups and 15 children.
And how did you start, what happened to start the church when you came?
Well, we just didn't, we've always had a church wherever we went, you know. We went to Wyoming once, and we had just a shell of a church, and we refinished it and fixed it all up and stayed with it a while, and then we came back to California. So,
But there was some specific thing that happened when you started the Costa Mesa Church. How did you fund it, and how did you do this?
well, how do we fund it? Well, we bought the ground with our insurance policy money that we cashed them in, you know. And then different people would buy a certain amount of cement, certain amount of lumber. Every Sunday they would just say, I'm going to buy this and I'm going to buy that. We just started in October of '40 to build.
And how long did it take to build it?
Well, we built, we had the left side of the building, the old building's there now, was finished first, and we had church on that side, and then all the materials was over on the right side that was finished later. I've got pictures where we were sitting on the left side of the church, you know, and the piano over there, and we just had to have church in half of it.
And how much was involved in the insurance policy when you bought the land?
I can't remember how much money it was that we paid for that corner of 22nd and Eldon. I should have kept it down, but like I said, I was working at the time, and I just didn't keep all those things down, I guess, in my mind.
And this was in 1940.
1940.
What do you remember about Costa Mesa in the early days?
Well, this little street out of 22nd Street was just a little narrow road, dirt road going down in front of where we bought the lot to build the church. It was just a little small town, 2,500. They had a gourd farm and a gladiolus farm across from the church. It was 5 acres of it.
I see. How did you, can you hear the air conditioner? Okay. How did you get around in those days? Did you have a car?
Yeah, we had a car. We lived in Anaheim at the time when we came to Costa Mesa. We was living there. We lived there a year after we took the church. And we drove back and forth down Harbor Boulevard. And we had a car.
How long did it take you to drive from Anaheim to Costa Mesa in those days?
It didn't take long because we just had a little narrow road to come down and there wasn't no traffic. We could zip down in half an hour.
Was there any other towns between?
Well, I don't really remember of any. Of course, we lived in Anaheim, and we came to the down harbor, so Sandy Ana wasn't built out like it is now. It was just we always come down Harbor Boulevard to the church.
Do you remember anyone who was converted in those early days that has really made a difference and impact in the world or anything?
I was just trying to think.
Or who's in the ministry today?
Not really.
Not really.
I know that some that's been saved, that's been saved maybe 30 years, it's done good, but I mean, way back, I mean, maybe not 30 years, maybe 20, 25 years. But way back early, I guess I was too busy with the church and working, and I didn't keep all those things down.
Did the church, or when did the church start into a missions program?
We started right away, and we used to have Speed the Light. We had young people that just loved to give to Speed the Light, and so it was a missionary church all the way through from the time we began with it, really.
How did you have your get the people involved in missions?
Well, I don't know. My husband was missionary minded, and they just followed along with him, and we had a number of missionaries on our list, and we had them to come and take the whole service, on sometimes all day Sunday, and we just loved it, and the people loved it.
Did you have fellowship meetings on the grounds or anything?
Well, we have had, yes. And then we had big vacation Bible schools. We would have 200 or 250. In 1944, we had 200, and I think we had more in 1946. We just have pictures of it where we had a great vacation Bible school in the summer.
So 10% of the population of Costa Mesa came to the vacation Bible school?
Yeah. Oh, the kids just came. It was beautiful.
Great. What is your favorite memory of the early days of Costa Mesa?
I don't can't remember exactly. I know I like Costa Mesa. I always liked it because we moved here in 1943, and I always liked Costa Mesa. I just love the area and the nice climate, and the people were beautiful.
Was the church surrounded at that time by fields of anything?
Well, right across on 22nd was all fields. All of it was. There's 5 acres there. Was all fields, gladolias and gourds. Right across from the lot that we bought for the church.
What do you think attracted you folks to come and take the pastorate at First Assembly?
Well, my husband he just felt one day when we was living in Anaheim, he was working. He had to work, and he was working as a paint contractor. We came from Missouri out here, and so he just had a burden to come to Costa Mesa. I guess the Lord just led him, and so the little pastor that was here, he was discouraged. He'd only been here 3 months. I can't remember his name. I wished I had have, put it down, but I didn't. And he just turned it over to us. And the church seemed to be just real happy to have us. And so we just started from there in this little store building on 22nd and Newport.
And how long did you stay at the church?
You mean how long did we stay?
Was your
Well,
time
we
there?
just like 2 months being 30 and a half years.
The previous pastors had 3 months and you were 30.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And we built 7 different times while we were there. We built Christian school. We had Christian school from 1948 and 49. We had 1st grade through the 8th. I have pictures of the graduating class of 1949.
And when did you build the building that had the round dome?
In 1940, that's when we started it, in October 1940. Mm-hmm.
And from there,
Well, we built there, and then we went and built the Christian school building. And Then we built the CA Chapel, stone building. And then we built the educational building. I think my husband said 7 times. I didn't count them up. But then and then we built 12 Sunday school rooms at the back of the first church. And then we built the sanctuary, the last sanctuary in '66. And we had the dedication '67. We were so tired we took off to Acapulco to see Margaret Classen in 1966. And when we come back, then we had the dedication of the new church, new sanctuary.
That's great. If you look back on this now, from today, looking at it from the vantage of today, what specifically can you point to that you knew that God was leading in this thing? As you look back today, not at the time when you were there, you probably couldn't see the Lord leading in that specific direction, but as you look back from today, what specific events happened that led to what Newport Mesa is today?
Well, it was just started on a good foundation, I know that, you know. And my husband, we both worked together as a team. I would go out and pick up maybe 25 children in a big van that the church had. First we just had a couple of station wagons, then they kind of played out, and then we got a nice van for me to drive. And so I'd pick up the children for Sunday school on Sunday. I'd be out picking them up. Then I'd pick up the older people. And we still continue to do that for the older people, and I think it's great. You really have to get in and work if you get anything done for the Lord. You really have to have a burden for it. And I think it's wonderful how our church has grown now. It's great. I'm just really thrilled over it.
When it came to the two churches merging together, how do you think the Lord worked this out so that the two churches merge together and become one thrust?
I think it was just a miracle. It really was, because we were really happy about it ourselves. Of course, Reverend Cronick, he was down with a stroke, but he was happy. He was so happy when he saw that George was going to come and be the senior pastor, you know. He was really thrilled. Even if he couldn't tell us that he was real happy about it. And I was more than happy, really. I really was. Of course, I had known the pastor, the previous, you know. I knew his dad and mother for years and years back in Missouri, but